Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Refrigerant Checkup with Dr. Chuck. I appreciate you taking time to be here. I got some important information today for those of you who work in the commercial refrigeration field. So think supermarkets and grocery stores, those type of applications. Whether you own, operate, service, design, build, those type of systems, there's a lot going on out in the state of California that you're going to want to be aware of. Obviously, things that take place in California can be adopted by other states, other parts of the country. If you hang in there, I promise I have a little tool for you that may help you sort through some of the details here, make your job a little easier. I'll talk about that at the end. But really, I want to review a part of the California proposed regulations. Everything is proposed at this point. But the one that focuses around the installed base or the installed bank of refrigerants. There are certain rules in other segments. There's going to be rules for new equipment, and we'll cover them at some other point. But it was clear when tackling this problem, since new construction, new store builds are such a small part of the overall impact and the overall base of refrigerants, that really the installed base needed to be addressed. Because there's a lot of things like R404, 507, R22 installed, and a host of other cats and dog refrigerants. But anyway, what CARB has proposed for reducing the environmental impact of the installed base of refrigerants, there's really three options or possibilities for ways to do that have been proposed. The first one is pretty prescriptive. It's basically saying everything has to be converted to operate on a refrigerant with a GWP less than 1400. It's pretty simple from a record keeping and administration standpoint. Execution and implementation obviously is going to be very complex because you're pretty much going to have to do something with every piece of equipment, every system over 50 pounds. The next two options are very closely related, but the way you calculate emissions reductions may give you a slightly different answer depending if you use option 2 or 3. So option 2 is what they're calling the greenhouse gas potential reduction, which basically you sum up all the refrigerants you have and establish a baseline, and then there's a mandated reduction from that baseline. So I think the baseline is going to be 2018, and it's going to be a 55% reduction required by 2030, according to this calculation. Option 3 is very similar, but it takes away the need for a baseline, and that just requires it's a fleet standard or an owner standard for all the stores, all the systems. And that goal there is to reduce the average global warming potential, and the average is calculated based on adding up all the pounds of refrigerants times their individual global warming potentials divided by the total pounds, and getting that average to below 1400 GWP in the same time frame. There's some subtle details in there. If you have a lot of stores, there's a halfway check-in point where you need to show some reduction before you get to the final 2030 outcome. So what does this mean when we're addressing the installed base? There's a couple of things right off the bat that I think are important. One is 404 systems are going to have something done to them for the most part. It's such a high GWP compared to everything else, you're not going to be able to escape converting 404, 507 type systems. The good news is there's good options for doing that, and I want to probably have another video where I go into the details of actually doing those conversions. The other thing to note is what you do with R22 matters as well. And if you've some folks still have a lot of R22, others have converted away from R22, so they're mostly beyond that one. But things like R22 conversions to 407A now is going in the wrong direction GWP-wise. So even though you're getting out of ozone-depleting refrigerant, you don't want to be going to something like 407A because it's just making it more difficult to meet the goals that you're going to establish, the targets that are going to be established. So you want to look at something other than 407A for converting refrigeration applications of R22. Third, as I mentioned, there's going to be a lot of number crunching and figuring out individual scenarios based on your footprint, what works best. So we put together a little calculator tool. It's nothing too fancy, but I think it's going to be very helpful. Some of the examples I'm going to show here and in the future will be based on using that tool. And we'll be glad to share that with you and give you that tool for you to use for your individual things. So I want to do just one example here and show some potential options depending on the installed bank that someone might have. And I'm going to take a very simple example to start. An operator who, say, has 10 stores, all of them are operating on 404 as a refrigerant, and all of them have a 1,000-pound charge, just to keep the numbers round. And so you can see the different options that you have. So based on that footprint, we can determine the baseline. So you see the baseline numbers here. If we add everything up, we get about 3.9 times 10 to the 7th GHG potential. Or if we wanted to do an average GWP of that footprint, obviously it's going to be 3,900 because everything has the same GWP. So using our little calculator, for this hypothetical situation, 10 stores, 1,000 pounds of 404 in each store, you see the baseline and where we need to get to. So a couple simple pathways there. One would just be, say, convert 404A racks to run on R449A XP40. Again, that's a pretty straightforward process. A lot of people have done that already. But you can see you would have to do most of the stores. You'd have to do about 9 of them, 9 out of the 10, and that would get you down to about 1.65, so you'd meet the regulatory guidelines that are required. Another option you could do is you could tear out a 404 system and replace it with a transcritical CO2 system, for example, which has a GWP of 1. You'd end up having to do about 6 stores, putting aside the logistics of tearing out a system in an operating store and putting it in. You'd have to replace in whole 6 stores worth of refrigeration equipment to a transcritical CO2, and that would get you down to about 1.56 on this global warming greenhouse gas potential calculation method. So both of those will get you compliant regulatory. So then you start looking at other things. Why would one of these pathways make more sense than the other, or is it a combination? Obviously, it's going to get a lot more complex because everyone's not going to have other refrigerants other than 404. But for this example, you could look at the cost of doing that, and that's obviously cost is an important part of all this. It's an important factor in the overall equation. So very round numbers, I will put a stake in the ground and say a brand new transcritical installed is going to be $1 million per store. So to do 6 of those for this scenario, you were talking about $6 million. The conversions, obviously a lot cheaper because you're using the same equipment. It's just a labor and materials. So a stake in the ground, that's $100,000 to convert a store system from 404 to 449A. So grand total to get compliant of these 2 pathways, one you're looking at about $6 million versus under $1 million, about $900,000, very rough numbers for the conversion to the HFO blend 449. So a lot to consider there. When you add R22 in the mix, the pathways get a little more complicated. 22 has a lot lower GWP than 404. But some of the options are, as I mentioned before, going in the wrong direction. So I'm going to have another video on describing the actual details of how to do those conversions, because I think there's going to be a lot of 404 to 449A conversions required to meet these regulations in California and the rest of the country. Hopefully our calculator will help you look at your different options. We'll be glad to offer our technical support and what's feasible and what we think people have done, kind of share best practices. But again, just wanted to get this out in front of you. It's all a proposal at this point, but sooner rather than later, it's going to be a reality. A lot of people are underway So it's not just for people in California anymore. We have the U.S. Climate Alliance states and a lot of other people, Kigali on the international level, moving in this direction. So thanks for hanging in there. Hit me up with an email. I'll be glad to send you out a copy of our calculator tool for you to play around with. Any other questions refrigerant related, commercial refrigeration, air conditioning, chemistry related, lubricants, doesn't really matter. If I can't find the answers, I'll find someone who will. And again, thanks. Hit subscribe and like. Tell your friends about this. If there's topics you want to hear, we want to keep being able to communicate out and keep this information in front of you in a fast, focused, and hopefully informative way. Thanks again, and we'll be talking to you soon. So long.